Amen. Let's kick it off. We're online. Hi, we have a special guest for you you're going to enjoy, Miss Wendy VanDyke. Did I get it right? Yes. Of course, pastors tell me to remind you, hold the microphone up there. Here you go, Wendy.
Thanks for having me, ladies. Thank you to Flossie for inviting me. I heard she spread some rumors saying I'm really good, but I don't know about all that. So when Flossie told me to come out here and speak, I thought, sure, why not? I had something booked today with the Catholic Charities downtown for the tricentennial with my job. I'm a nurse practitioner. Flossie and I met at the VA. And so I was down there, and she told me about this, and I thought, yeah, I prayed about it, and God said, just go out and open your mouth. I have not spoken at churches before, so this is my first time, and I asked Flossie, I said, what's the theme? And she says, I don't know, let me find out from Kim. Yeah, and so she told me, and I thought about it, and I prayed about it, and I said, God, I have so many favorite people in the Bible, so many lessons learned that I can talk about destiny, but Joseph kept coming up. Joseph kept coming up, and I thought, let me talk about Joseph and his destiny and how it relates to us today. So what is destiny? It's a predetermined course of events, often held to be an irresistible power or agency. In Genesis 37, 5-9, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. Any of you know some haters out there? So he said to them, please hear this dream which I have dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. Keep in mind, Joseph was a 17-year-old, probably a cocky little kid at this point. Just know he had a dream, and he wanted to tell his brothers how good he was compared to them. And his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream. God wasn't finished with Joseph yet. And told it to his brothers and said, look, I have dreamed another dream. At this point, I'm sure his brothers were livid. They were jealous, and they were getting annoyed at Joseph and his attitude. And this time, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me. Since these dreams seemed to indicate that Joseph's father, mother, and brothers were going to bow down and serve him, the brothers were not happy. In his youthful enthusiasm, Joseph, who was 17 years old, like I said, may have interpreted the dreams to mean he would be a great person and his family would exalt him. But God was working in Joseph toward his destiny. One could say that Joseph was a cocky, arrogant dreamer. As a reward for his dream, Joseph's brothers devised a plot to rid themselves of him and make some money in the process. When Joseph was sent out to the pastures to check on his brothers, Dad said, go on out, Joseph, check on your brothers for me. They attacked him. They took his special coat, covered it with blood, and threw him into the pit. And I'm sure some of us sitting here today, including myself, have been in that place. We've been in a pit, whether it's financial, whether it's on the job, whatever. Joseph was in a physical pit, but there's also the pit of life. Though some wanted to simply kill him, they decided to sell him into slavery instead. His brothers returned and got him out of the pit. And I'm sure Joseph thought, that was all a silly joke. They came back to get me. Now I'm going to go home and tell my father. Deliverance had come, but it was not quite what Joseph expected. His brothers did not take him home. They handed him over to slave traders in a caravan headed to Egypt. Then took his coat to their father and told him Joseph was dead. And can you imagine how Jacob felt? Because that was the son of Jacob's beloved wife, Rachel. His other brothers were Joseph's stepbrothers. Once Joseph was in Egypt, he was sold to Potiphar, who happened to be a captain of the king's guard. What will Joseph do in Potiphar's house? Will Joseph go there, whine and complain and said, you know what? I'm not even supposed to be here. Let me tell you what my brothers did to me. But Joseph didn't do that. Joseph worked in the pit. Joseph did the best that he knew how in the pit. Would he complain to God about how this was not part of his dream? Would he do just enough work to get by and stay alive? No, Joseph begins to apply himself in his slavery. And that's what we need to do sometimes when you're in the pit. Sometimes when you're in a place where you don't feel that you belong or things are not going right, is do the best that you can, because we do not know God's purpose for our lives. We do not know what our destiny is. He does so well that one day Potiphar comes out and puts him in charge of his entire household. I don't know that he understood this, but at that point, destiny was at work in Joseph's life. He had no idea why he was in Potiphar's household, but he chose to do the best he could with what he had been placed before him. He paid attention to what he could control and became the best slave Potiphar had ever seen. This led to his promotion into a position that Joseph would hold again and again. He was head of the house in everything but name. Whatever was done in the house was done at his direction. This was not a bad way to be a slave, but much more was going on. Destiny was at work, moving Joseph to where he needed to be. I want to encourage you today to look around you. There are things you can't control. Complaining, whining, wishing will only make your situation worse. Find something that we can control, apply yourself to that, and trust that destiny, the hand of God himself, will work to bring to pass what he has for you. I grew up in a small island in the Southern Caribbean. In 1979, at the age of 15, there was a massive volcanic eruption. I was visiting with my younger brothers and sisters' friends at the time. My mom was in the States because my eldest sister was here getting married to someone. But it was the beginning of my destiny. Someone knocked on the door. I was the eldest of 5 siblings, and they said, "Come on outside. The volcano is erupting." I walked out. It was the middle of the day. It looked like the middle of the night. The skies was black. The ashes were falling, and it was red. It looked like hell, literally. I had no time to prepare. It said, "Pack your stuff, get your brothers and sisters. Your dad's coming for you guys." My mom got word. There was an order to evacuate the entire island because prior in 1901, the island had erupted and practically sunk. There was, I think, a handful of survivors. We headed straight, went home, grabbed the bag, and he said, "Get to the airport. She's not even going to come home. She's going to fly down and meet you at the airport." We got there and didn't even have time to say goodbye to friends, to relatives, to my father. He had to stay. We got a ticket out. Then the word came, no one can fly because the volcano was about to erupt again several times in the middle of the flight path. Destiny. Then there's a man from American Express. He must have been visiting the island on a vacation, and he kept pacing back and forth. He says, "I have to get off this island. There's one pilot here, a 6-seater. He said, "But he would not fly with just me. I need 5 more passengers." There were 5 of us. He said he'll take us to Barbados, and then from there we can get out to wherever else, whatever other part of the world. My mom sent a message to my father. He said, "We have 5 planes. We can get out. 5 of us, 5 seats." And he said, "Go for it. I want you guys off." So he sent someone. We paid the guy and all 5 of us, young children, scared, on this little plane flying about 99 miles east of us to Barbados. And I sat up front, and it was like a plane that was just wiping the ashes off. And I learned to pray harder. I was saved and called to grace at 12 years old. But I knew a God, and I knew that he would get me there safe. And we landed, spent 7 days, came to Greenwich, Connecticut, and I never went back, only to visit. But we settled here. And I say that, and I'll talk about where God took me back then to where I am now. But in continuing with Genesis 39:19-23, so it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. The king's prisoners were confined in that prison. And he was there in the prison, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Destiny again. The favor of God was still on Joseph. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did, there it was, his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. If the Lord is with you, who can be against you? In Potiphar's house, Joseph did not complain about what he could not control. Once again, you didn't hear murmuring and grumbling from Joseph. Joseph grew where they planted him. We say that in the military. You grow where they plant you. I'm 20 years in the Air Force. I retired in 2007. And that's a motto for any military member because you move so frequently. So God was with Joseph, and God blessed him. None of what has happened to Joseph to this point in the story seems like it was bringing him to his godly destiny. In reality, everything that happened to him was by the hand of God. To fulfill his destiny, he had to be in Egypt. He was now in Egypt. To fulfill his destiny, he had to know how to manage resources. He was learning that in Potiphar's house. Now another step in his destiny is coming to pass. When Potiphar was away on a trip, his wife decides to seduce the handsome young slave. He refused, citing his loyalty to her husband and God. She takes his garment as he leaves her, and she accuses him of trying to seduce her. What the enemy meant for good. Potiphar believed his wife and threw Joseph in prison. It would seem that no matter what Joseph does, things go wrong for him. Or do they really? Someone at this point would start saying, why me, God? Why? I went from the pit to the palace, and now I'm in prison. What are you doing? It's been years. What have I done? Start murmuring and complaining. But Joseph stayed focused. Joseph knew a God, a great God. He was arrogant to his brothers, and it threw him in the pit. Now he is faithful and loyal, and he is wrongly accused and sent to prison with no indication of trial or sentence. However, we have already seen that the pit led him to Egypt. He had to be in Egypt. Slavery led him to Potiphar's house, where he began to learn administration. He had to know that. But how could prison be the plan of God? How could being in prison be of God? After all that Joseph had done, he resisted the temptation of a seductive woman. It is important to note something here. Potiphar was a captain to the king's guard. Look at verse 20. Joseph was going to where the king's prisoners were held. There is significant destiny. This is significant because destiny is once again at work in Joseph's life. Everything was being aligned according to God's will. In the prison, Joseph chooses to look past the disappointment and once again apply himself to what he has control over. He cannot get out of prison. That is out of his control. He can, however, put to work what he learned at Potiphar's house. Soon he is in charge of the prisoners, and the warden doesn't even check into what was placed under Joseph's authority. This is interesting. Before long, we see the hand of destiny again over Joseph's life. Who was in prison? There were 2 new prisoners sent to the king's prison where Joseph was. And Joseph is in charge of the prisoners. He was put in charge of those 2 prisoners. If any of them has a problem, they came to Joseph, not the warden. If Joseph had come to Egypt as a free man, he would never have been in Potiphar's house. If he had been in someone else's house and was thrown into prison, he would not have been sent to the king's prison. If he had not been in the king's prison, he would not have met these 2 men. Destiny saw to it that he was right where he needed to be at precisely the right time. It could not have seemed like destiny at work when Joseph was falsely accused and rewarded for his integrity within prison. However, it was. He had to meet these 2 men. One of the men was the king's cupbearer. The other oversaw his wine. The other one was the king's baker, the one who oversaw the king's bread. One day he noticed that these 2 men were troubled. He asked why, and he finds out that they each had a dream. Joseph began his journey as an arrogant dreamer as a 17-year-old. However, much has happened to him in the years since then. He is no longer the person he was. Destiny has been working on him as well as his circumstances. He is about to become an interpreter of dreams instead of the dreamer. And this is very, very important. God had to refine Joseph. It's like Daniel in the den, being refined. Joseph needed to be sharpened. In Genesis 40, verse 8, and they said to him, we each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter for it. So Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please. And the pit led Joseph to a slave caravan. Once again, the caravan led him to Potiphar's house. Potiphar's house led him to a specific prison where the king's special prisoners went. The blessing of God upon Joseph led him to the point where he was in charge of every situation he found himself in. Now the king's cupbearer and baker are in his prison, and he sees they're distressed. Joseph asks them why and finds out they have had dreams that needed interpreting. He was called to the pit and had to understand these 2 men that came in with dreams that were very perplexing to them. And you can read about those dreams in Genesis 40. But for the purposes, that's not important here. What is important is that Joseph interpreted the dreams with astonishing accuracy. The baker is told his dream means he will die. Soon the executioners came for him. The cupbearer is told he will live and be restored to prison. And he vowed to remember Joseph to the king. Joseph asked one thing of him. He said, when you go back, just tell them to remember me. Hoping that he'll get out of prison. Hoping that maybe God will see that he did not belong there. As this man leaves, Joseph is filled with hope that his long ordeal may finally be over. And one of the most difficult things about trusting in the power of destiny is timing. We have one time frame in which we want things to happen, and God, destiny, has another. I am sure Joseph thought this man would go right back and tell the king about him immediately. Look what this man in prison did for me. He interpreted my dream. And Joseph hoped that this would bring the king a quick release from the king. Instead, 2 more years went by before anything changed. What does Joseph do? He does what he always does. He does not complain or whine. Again, I am sure he had his days just like we would. But he cannot control what the king's cupbearer will do. He can control what he can do. He continues to bless those for whom he has been given responsibility and continue to apply himself in his job. Most important, I believe, he grew both the skill that he will later need and his trust in destiny to bring him to the purpose for which he was created. Finally, one day, the king himself had a dream. No one can interpret his dream. They were not able to. The cupbearer, something went off and clicked, and he thought about Joseph, and he turned to the king and said, I know someone who can interpret your dreams because he interpreted mine. He tells him that this prisoner called Joseph could interpret the bearer's dream. After all this time in a pit, in slavery and in prison, Joseph is summoned to Pharaoh. If Joseph had never been in the pit, he could never have been a slave. If he had never been a slave, he would never have been in Potiphar's house. If he had never been in Potiphar's house, he would never have been in that particular prison. If he had never been in that prison, he would never have met the cupbearer and interpreted his dream. And if he had never interpreted the cupbearer's dream, he would never have been called to the Pharaoh. Now he stands there ready, prepared by the hand of God and the working of destiny to take another step in his journey to his purpose. To make a long story short, he interprets the king's dream to mean that there will be 7 prosperous years and 7 lean years. Pharaoh must put someone over the distribution of grain so that in the lean years there will be enough left over from the prosperous years and no one will starve. Egypt will be in a powerful position if they have food when no one else does. Joseph did not lobby for a job. He has learned 2 important things here. First, there is no difference between the prison and the palace if God is with you. Second, how dreams play out is in God's hand. Destiny will do what is right for Joseph. The king, of course, sees none more wise than Joseph and puts him in charge of the food supply of Egypt. He became the administrator. The same job he held for Potiphar and in the prison. He is second in Egypt, only to Pharaoh. He is in charge of the whole country in all but by name. What a wonderful end. Joseph had reached his destiny, you would think, but he had not. The palace is just one more step to get him to the place of his purpose. And in Genesis 45, you see, then Joseph said to his brothers came to Egypt with money because the famine came, and they had to leave. Later on, again, in Genesis 45, 3-7, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Joseph recognized his brother when they came to get grain because of the famine, but the brothers did not recognize Joseph. Joseph knew who they were. And this is when he revealed himself to his brothers, and he says, I am Joseph. Does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed in his presence. And Joseph said to his brothers, please come near to me. So they came near. Then he said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. But now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth, and to serve your lives by a great deliverance. In the final stage of Joseph's story, he has become the virtual ruler of Egypt, from the pit to the palace. He controls the food supply in a time of famine. The way most of us think this would seem to be the destiny God had created him to fulfill. We see the greatness and power God has given him and think, surely this is destiny. People were bowing down to him as he went through the streets. He had whole nations coming to him for food. Joseph, a great man, he has arrived at God's destination for his life. However, what was the dream God had given him? It was not about nations or even the citizens of one nation, Egypt bowing before him. It was about
Testing.
Thank you. The devil's a liar. Where was I? It was not about nations or even the citizens of one nation. Egypt bound before him. It was his father. It was about his mother and his brothers. The purpose Joseph was created to fulfill, again, was not to lead Egypt. That was just one more stop on the way to his destiny, to our destiny. It was one more step in the journey. To God, it was no different than the pit, Potiphar's house, or the prison. He had to be in each of those places to fulfill his purpose. Now he has to be in the palace, controlling the flow of food to the people. If we can see the power of this thought, it can change our lives. God has a destination for each and every one of us. Every step along the way is important. God will place us in each other's way to help. But we need to trust God to trust our destiny, to bring us every step of the way to our goal. We may or may not be great in the world's eye, but it is the goal that is important and the goal God is moving us towards. Trust in that, and we can enjoy each step along the way. One day, Joseph is introduced to some men. Immediately he recognizes them, but they do not recognize him. His brothers, the same brothers that threw him into a pit and sold him into slavery. He had the opportunity to repay them 1,000-fold for their treachery and cruelty. He can kill them, refuse them, torture them, anything else Joseph wanted to do, but he did not do that. The story takes some very strange turns at this point. He gives them food. He puts the money back in their bags, had them brought back and accused them of stealing. This goes on a number of times until he finally makes them bring his full brother Benjamin to him. And it was the custom in those days. His father had 2 wives. Only Benjamin was the full brother of Joseph. Joseph was successful. He can do whatever he wanted, again, with no punishment possible. However, in the end, we see the great revelation dawn upon him. All of the years came into focus. Every step of the journey is seen in a new light. It was not his brothers who put him in the pit or sold him into slavery. It wasn't them. They had an evil purpose in what they did, but they were not being used. They were just being used by God. It was destiny behind it all. It was the unseen hand moving him from the palace to this place. The hand was molding him, training him, and preparing him for this particular moment. What was the lesson? What are some of the lessons out of Joseph's story? Each and every person is born with a purpose from God. We call this purpose destiny. We must understand that it is God who brings this destiny to pass in our lives as we follow him and do his will. God has shown Joseph his destiny in a dream, but that 17-year-old did not understand nor handle this knowledge well. He angered his brothers, and they threw him into a pit. In that pit, he had no options but one. He had to trust that God would do something to get him out. God did get him out. Unfortunately, he was sold into slavery and taken to the home of a captain in the king's guard named Potiphar. Joseph had a dream from God, but he was not prepared for the fulfillment of that dream. Not at that age. The next thing he knew, he was in a pit. Most of us have been in pits at one time or another, whether we have had a dream about our destiny or know nothing of what it might be. We can't imagine how a pit could be part of it. However, in the life of Joseph, the pit was one step on a long journey that was going to bring him to his destiny. Joseph did not give up in the pit. It would have been easy for him to just lay down and wait to die. I don't believe he did. I believe he did the only thing he could do in a pit. He couldn't climb out of it. The only ones he could hear him were the ones who put him in there, his brothers. So he couldn't cry for help. He could only wait in the pit and believe that God would somehow get him out. Destiny, God himself, was watching over Joseph in the pit. And this destiny has a way of bringing deliverance to us in some ways we may not want. Joseph had no desire to go to Egypt. He certainly didn't want to be a slave. But that was where destiny was taking him. Why? Because Egypt was where he had to fulfill God's purpose for his life. I am sure Joseph would have preferred to get there some other way, but there was no other way. So at God's own hand and through the actions of his angry brothers, destiny took Joseph to Egypt as a slave. Some things must simply be our own bad choices or the attacks of the enemy. Trust in God. Trust in his destiny for your life. If God is working for you, like I said, who can ever be successful against you? The only one that can keep you from the destiny God has for your life is you. Yield to God even when you don't understand what's going on in your life. Remember all things that Joseph went through. Some of it was difficult, but in it all, God was with him and blessed him. In the end, destiny was moving and shaping Joseph to fulfill something wonderful he is doing in the same as God is doing in your life. In each horrible development of Joseph's life, 2 things happened. God was with Joseph and blessed him, and God moved him inexorably towards the fulfillment of God's plan for his life. Destiny is the purpose God has for each of us. To enter into destiny, the first step is to be born again. After we make the decision to follow God, there is an unseen hand which moves us on a course to fulfill the purpose of God in our lives. The power to bring about this destiny is God's. If we follow him daily in obedience, he will bring us to the end that he created for us. Even in our mistakes, God is able to maneuver and adjust us in our circumstances to accomplish the good and for our lives. In every step of Joseph's journey, he was blessed. I believe that it's important for us to see. Life does not always work out the way we want it to. Many times, the things we see as the hardest are the very things that shape us into the people we need to become. However, even in the hardest of times, we see the blessing of God on Joseph's life. He was a slave and a prisoner, but in both, he was elevated to be the one who was in charge. God may not change everything about where you are in life, but in any circumstances, he will be with you and bless you if you trust him. You and I have been on a journey. I'm sure not everything in that journey has been the hand of God. However, in everything, God has been working. Destiny has led us and prepared us for each and every step we have taken. When we cooperate with what God is doing, we find that we end up where God wants us. And we trust him. He blesses us throughout the journey. When the devil comes against us, we stand on God's word and he helps us to overcome him. Trust in this force of destiny in your life. God loves you, he knows you, and he is moving you toward a good end. How do we know that Joseph's destiny was to save his brothers? Because we hear very little of Joseph after this point. You are important to the plan of God. God has created you for a wonderful purpose. Give yourself to daily doing the will of God, and in the end, you will find the purpose and the destiny. In the end, you will stand before the Lord and hear the highest words any of us will ever hear. It may not be in this lifetime, but when we stand before God on Judgment Day, the most important words will be, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." At that point, it will not matter who knew our name or what our circumstances of life might have been. At that point, we will enter into a real reward for a life was well lived. God is doing a unique work around the world today by raising up Josephs. Some are still in the pit stage of their pilgrimage, while others are heading to its fruitfulness. It takes years of preparation and testing to be a true Joseph. The psalmist tells us in Psalm 105, 16-22, talking about David. He called down famine on the land and destroyed all their supplies of food, and he sent a man before them, Joseph, sold as a slave. They bruised his feet with shackles, his neck was put in irons, till what he foretold came to pass, till the word of the Lord proved him true. The king sent and released him. The ruler of the people set him free. He made him master of his household, ruler over all he possessed, to instruct his prince as he pleased and teach his elders wisdom. Many of us are on a course in life that some may not even understand. And like I said, I've been there many times. When I landed in America in 79, after going through the horrendous disruption that I did, I didn't know what God had in store for me. I landed on the shores of Connecticut and immediately started school, new friends, new neighborhoods, new culture. But I got to work and did what God called me to do. Went to college and graduated as a nurse. Worked for a year and decided to join the Air Force. It was not an easy route for my mom. Ultimately, in the States, the separation was great on my parents, and they wound up getting a divorce, and my dad stayed behind. So we had to find a way ourselves, and I wound up at the University of Connecticut and joined the Air Force a year after I graduated. But I wanted to give back to this country what the country had given me, a place, a refuge. And throughout my life, my work in life, God has used me in tremendous and mighty ways. I call it marketplace ministry. I've always been able to find folks to minister to or my patients. I've prayed with them when all hope seems gone. And some people, unfortunately, don't like that. When they see God's light shine through you, it's a threat. But God has put us, each and every one of us here for a purpose. And we may not know a destiny, like I said, and my destiny keeps unfolding. And I thought, as I was Flossie knows this, in the military, I would hear things like, someone got a promotion to a next rank, and it's who you know. But I knew a God, I knew an awesome God, and I would pray when people were promoted before I did, because they may not have liked my philosophy or my God, or like me talking religion, but I would always find a Bible group at work, and we'd sit and pray. We'd pray through everything. And I heard some nurses talking one day, and they were talking about the White House, and that was their dream and their destiny, and that's where they always wanted to go. And I thought, geez, wouldn't that be nice? And out of the blue, one day I was stationed at Dover Air Force Base, and I'll make this brief, but I went home after a hard day. I stayed focused like Joseph. Wherever God planted me, I grew. And I gave him all the glory, and still does. And I had a rough day. I walked in as a young captain at Dover Air Force Base, and God gave me favor with the nurse in charge, the chief nurse there, and she called me one day and said, Wendy, this was after a 16-hour day, and I walked home, and it was 8 o'clock at night, and I was preparing for an inspection at my hospital. She said, something just came across my desk, and I thought about you. And it's going to anger a lot of the other nurses, but I don't care. I said, what is it? She said, it's a message that for a White House nurse. And I thought about you right away, and I want you to put in for it. I said, no way. I said, I've got 2 young children. They were 4 and 5. And my husband, I said, they won't want me. I'm at a small hospital for one, and I have children, and I heard that they traveled a lot, and I heard nurses talking about it, my other base. And I tried to dissuade her and discourage her, and she said, no, I'm not going to take no for an answer. So I went, and I said, what do I need to do? She said, you need to fill this out and to put your resume together, and it needs to be on my desk at 5 o'clock in the morning, and this was 9 o'clock at night. I didn't have a CV or a bio. I didn't have any of that stuff. And I couldn't get rid of her. I thought about it, but I didn't think that I was good enough. But God saw something different. So I went and I filled it out just to please her, and I dropped it off on the desk and never thought about it again until about 2 or 3 weeks later, and I saw her at a meeting, and she said, great job. I go, for what? She said, you made the first cut. I said, what's the first cut? She said, your name went up to the Pentagon for consideration. And I just prayed and thanked God for even that. And I said, I thought, not this little girl that came off of a plane and was evacuated to this country. And I said, thank you, Colonel VanDyke, for having faith in me. And she said, not a problem. Good luck. A couple more weeks later, I didn't think about it, and got another thumbs up at a meeting, and I said, what now? And she said, you made another cut. Congratulations. I said, what's this cut now? She said, you got selected to go, your name was placed in the top 10 or top 15 to go to another panel for consideration. I go, I didn't even expect that. And I said, thank you again. And then one day she said, Wendy, you are selected one of 6 to interview at the White House for this position. And I thought, no, that can't be. But the hand of God, destiny. So I said, wonderful, what do I do? She said, they'll send you a letter. I'm out of it this time. I don't know what they do after that. She said, they'll take over. About a week later, I went to the mailbox, and there's this little white envelope, and the return address just said, the White House. We all know the address, right? The whole world knows the address. So I went and I opened it, and it was raining that day. I don't know if it was my tear or if it was a raindrop. And it says, congratulations, you've been one of 6 selected to go to the White House for an interview. But God. And I thought, okay, what do I do? And I started naming, go through the magnetometer, go through the West Gate, do that. Don't bring guns or knives or blades with you. So I did, and I showed up at the hotel, and there were a few, I guess they put all the candidates at the same hotel, because I saw everybody else walking around with their parents, and I overheard some of the candidates talking and how excited they were, and I thought, I'm here by myself. And I said, God's got this. I woke up and I went to the interview the next day, and they said, hey, we're going to go from the old executive office building, we're going to go to the West Wing now, the real West Wing. This is not the TV West Wing. And I just said, okay. So we started walking over there, guiding us over there for the interview, and then I just stood in my truck, and I go, is that Al Gore? And it was under the Clinton administration, and he just turned around and waved. Went through the interview process. It went really well. I thanked them. I thank God for getting me that far, and I walked out, and I went home, and I really didn't think anything of it. And they asked some very pointed questions. I was with security the same day with some even more pointed questions. I went back to work, and I thank God for what he had done in my life so far without me asking. And about 2 weeks went by, and normally in the military, any news comes from the commander on down to you. You're not the first one to receive it. And I was working one day, and they were all gone. And an inspection was going on. It was Friday. It was the end of the inspection process, and they all went to the airport to take the team back. And I was in my office, and the phone rang, and one of my technicians said, I was a captain then. He said, Captain VanDyke, it's for you. And I think it's the White House. I said, stop, John. It's not the time. I'm busy. He said, no, I'm serious. I said, no, you're not serious, he said. And then the doctors knew him, and he goes, I think he's serious. So I went over and I picked the phone up. He says, is this Captain VanDyke? I said, yes, it is. And he said, congratulations, you've been selected as the White House nurse. I said, cut it out, Bob. He said, what are you talking about? I said, now is not the time. I don't have time for this. I'm really busy. Because I had the text, they would go to different part of the hospitals and call me. They would tease me because they knew I was waiting for this call, and they would laugh about it. So I thought, they were doing it again this time. And he said, no, seriously. I says, okay, if it's you, Dr. So-and-so, what were you wearing that day when you interviewed me? And he told me, and I think I just blacked out, and the doctor saw that everything fell out my hand. She put a chair under me. She said, sit down, take a number. Anything you do, just take a number. I said, can I have a number? So I just, in automation, I wrote the number down. And she said, what did he tell you? I said, I don't recall a single word. I said, I'm dead serious. She said, that's why I asked you to take a number. She said, now you're going to drink some water, compose yourself, and you're going to call back and apologize, and you're going to ask every single word what he just said to go over with you again. And I did just that, and he said, not a problem. I get this a lot. He went over everything, and I graciously accepted. The news media got a hold of it and asked for an interview, and I told them no. And the wing commander got a hold of that. He said, you can't tell them no. This is my base. I tell them no. I said, okay. So they came, and they followed me around. So I served at the White House for 4 years. And as Flossie know, a lot of people when I was at the VA with Flossie found out by accident, because I'm not one to go around and talk about that. The only reason I'm doing this is to tell you how God works and what a mighty God we serve. And that destiny is his and not ours. Like Joseph, we may feel that we're in the pit one day, that we're caught, whether it's in an earthquake or a tornado. And by the way, I went through Hurricane Katrina too, so. But God got me out of that as well. And I want to just tell you where you are in your lives today, whether you're in the pit, the palace, or someplace else. Have hope and keep God close to your heart. Always pray and always ask him what you can do for him sometimes. Not always what he can do for you. There's a lot that we can do for God, for those around us. So I want to thank you for having me. Thank you, Flossie. I appreciate it. Thank you.